The restaurant glowed with warm amber light chandeliers, scattering reflections across polished tables and glasses filled with sparkling water. It was the kind of place Claire Carter rarely stepped into a high-end Manhattan venue, where every chair seemed designed for people who belonged to another world. At 30, Claire was used to simple diners and quick meals between shifts at the community health center where she worked. Tonight, her twin sister Olivia had insisted she come, had pressed a sleek navy dress into her hands, and whispered about a man who might finally see her worth. Claire smoothed the skirt, now feeling both out of place and exposed. Her dark hair was pulled back, in a soft knot, her shoes borrowed, and slightly too tight. She had debated not coming, but Olivia had promised this was an opportunity, not a trap. Still, Claire's stomach twisted as she glanced around. Groups of executives laughed at tables, nearby their voices sharp with confidence, and at one corner Olivia sat, with 3 of her friends from the finance world, their designer suits and flawless makeup radiating power. They pretended to scroll on their phones, but their eyes darted toward her with thinly veiled amusement. The waiter pulled out a chair across from her, and then he walked in. Lucas Reed. He was taller than the pictures in magazines suggested. His black suit perfectly tailored his stride measured. At 35, he was already the head of Reed Biotechnics, a company that designed medical devices used in hospitals across the country. His wife had died years ago in a car accident, a tragedy the media still whispered about. And since then, his public image had been one of relentless focus and icy discipline. Tonight, he looked like a man carved from stone. Every line of his jaw, severe, his gray eyes unreadable. Claire felt her breath catch as he sat down across from her. His presence shifted the air. He did not smile. He barely glanced at the menu before resting his elbows on the table. His gaze was piercing heavy, and it landed on her with unsettling force. "Do you know who I am?" he asked quietly. The question did not echo, but it landed on the white tablecloth like a gavel in a courtroom. Claire blinked, startled. Her heart skipped. Around them, the laughter from Olivia's table swelled as if on cue. Olivia leaned toward her friends, one hand hiding her smile, the other holding up her phone, its red light recording. Claire swallowed hard. She had known he was important, but she had not expected him to ask such a question, not with that tone. Her palms grew damp against her lap. She shook her head slightly, her voice hesitant. "I do not think so. Should I?" The corner of his mouth tightened. It was not a smile, not even close. At the nearby table, Olivia's friends failed to contain their chuckles, and one of them whispered something that made the others snort behind manicured hands. Claire's stomach sank. The realization began to dawn slow and merciless. This was not a date arranged with care. This was a spectacle, a cruel setup. She forced herself to sit straighter, though her pulse thundered in her ears. Her twin sister's eyes glittered with triumph, as if she had finally succeeded in proving what she had always whispered, that Claire was unworthy, that Claire would always be the lesser twin. Lucas leaned back in his chair, studying her with the cool detachment of a man accustomed to boardrooms, not blind dates. His question still hung between them, unanswered, unbearable. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. The room seemed to hold its breath. Claire Carter had grown up in the shadow of her twin sister Olivia, and though they shared the same face, their lives could not have been more different. From childhood, Olivia had been the one with charm and beauty, polished for admiration, while Claire had been the quieter one, thoughtful and gentle, always taking care of others, but rarely commanding the room. Their mother used to joke that Olivia was lightning and Claire was the rain, one dazzling for a moment, and the other steady but overlooked. As adults, that contrast had only deepened. Olivia had climbed her way into New York's elite social circles, dating financiers, surrounding herself with people who measured worth by the cut of a suit or the cost of a watch. Claire, on the other hand, had chosen a different path. At 30, she was a single mom, raising her 8-year-old son Noah after her ex-husband had walked out 2 years earlier when the weight of responsibility became too heavy for him. She worked as a manager at a community health center, juggling patient needs, underfunded programs, and the never-ending paperwork of trying to keep a fragile system alive. Her salary was modest, her apartment small, but Noah's laughter filled it with a richness Olivia's penthouse could not buy. Claire's days were long but meaningful, and every choice she made circled back to him. He was bright, endlessly curious with hair that curled, when he sweated after soccer practice, and a stubborn streak that both tested and delighted her. He was the reason she stayed strong through the lonely nights, the reason she had not given up on herself entirely, even when her own heart ached with disappointment. Yet Claire carried scars of her own scars invisible to everyone except in the way she sometimes pressed her lips together when people praised her patience. Years ago, she had lost someone she loved during her residency rotation in a hospital. A patient she believed she could save if only she had fought harder against the system, if only she had been less naive. That failure gnawed at her, and when her ex-husband finally abandoned their marriage, she told herself it was because she was never enough. Olivia often reminded her of that, with cutting remarks disguised as sisterly concern. Olivia's beauty had opened doors, and her ambition kept her at the center of powerful networks. She was engaged once to a wealthy investment banker, though that relationship had crumbled when she realized he would never make her the star of his world. The breakup only intensified her hunger for status. Olivia believed that securing a man like Lucas Reed would crown her as queen of the financial kingdom. Lucas was the kind of man Olivia had been angling for all her life, wealthy, respected, powerful. But Lucas was also distant, and he had politely but firmly rejected Olivia's subtle advances in the past. When she heard whispers that her sister Claire might be introduced to him, her envy boiled over. Olivia could not stand the thought of the sister she dismissed as ordinary being seen as worthy in the eyes of someone like Lucas. It was that jealousy sharpened by years of competition that inspired the cruel joke of the blind date. She wanted to see Claire humiliated to remind her once and for all of her place. Lucas Reed's backstory was different, yet equally steeped in shadows. At 35, he carried the weight of a man who had known both triumph and devastating loss. He had built Reed Biotechnics from the ground up, starting as an engineer obsessed with designing medical devices that could improve patient recovery. His company had grown, rapidly earning government contracts, partnerships with hospitals, and recognition in major journals. Colleagues admired his brilliance, but also feared his intensity, because Lucas demanded perfection and tolerated no excuses. His life might have been balanced once when his wife Emily was alive. She had been the warmth to his steel, a painter who filled their home with color and music. grounding him when work threatened to consume him. But 5 years earlier, an accident had taken her away. On a rain-slick road, leaving Lucas a widower with a toddler daughter, Sophie. The grief nearly broke him, but where others crumbled inward, Lucas turned his sorrow into armor. He withdrew from friends, cut ties with anyone who tried to console him, and poured everything into his company and into raising Sophie as best he could. Yet Sophie carried her own burden. The trauma of losing her mother had struck her deeply. She grew quiet, her words dwindling until finally she stopped speaking almost entirely. Specialists called it selective mutism, a form of PTSD. Therapists tried play therapy, art therapy, even medication trials, but nothing seemed to open the locked door inside her. She communicated in gestures, in looks, in rare scribbles on paper. Lucas tried to hide his despair behind his stern exterior, but inside he felt helpless. For all his billions, he could not buy his daughter's voice back. He feared that her silence was permanent, that his failure to protect Emily had scarred Sophie beyond healing. He built walls around himself, believing that any emotional entanglement would only end in pain. He had turned away women who pursued him, some for his wealth, and others genuinely curious about the man beneath the CEO mask. He simply did not believe he had anything left to give. So it was with practiced caution that Lucas agreed to the blind date. His assistant had nudged him, his board had whispered that it was time to re-enter society, and finally Olivia had slipped through with the suggestion of someone shy, respectable, a woman who admired him. He did not expect much. He assumed it would be another evening of polite conversation, followed by a discreet dismissal. He certainly did not expect to find himself seated across from Claire, who carried herself with nervous dignity that did not fit the role of a social climber. He studied her carefully, searching for the angle, the reason Olivia would have arranged this. Claire, unaware of the depths of his skepticism, tried to steady herself. The echoes of Olivia's laughter from the nearby table made it clear she was being watched, tested, perhaps even mocked. Yet beneath her anxiety, she carried the quiet resilience of someone who had endured more than others could see. Lucas noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass, but also the way she straightened her shoulders, refusing to crumble. Parallel to this, Olivia whispered to her friends, already tasting victory. She imagined Claire stumbling over her words, Lucas growing cold, the evening dissolving in humiliation. In Olivia's mind, this was justice. She deserved to be admired, not her sister, who wasted her life in underfunded clinics and modest apartments. Olivia's jealousy had never been about money alone. It was about the way people responded to Claire's sincerity, the way neighbors trusted her, the way children gravitated toward her kindness. That intangible light drove Olivia mad because it was something she could never buy, no matter how flawless her appearance or how wealthy her partner. By the time Claire sat across from Lucas in that glowing restaurant, the stage had been perfectly set. On one side of the room, Olivia and her entourage waited for entertainment. On the other, Lucas watched with skeptical eyes, sharpened by years of betrayal and loss, and in the center, Claire balanced on the fragile edge of dignity and despair. She had no idea that her son Noah and Lucas's daughter Sophie would soon collide in ways none of them could predict, bridging worlds with the innocence only children possess. But for now, all she knew was that her sister's trap had been sprung, and she was caught in it with nowhere to run. Olivia had not needed to work very hard to persuade Claire into agreeing to the blind date. She had woven the suggestion with just enough warmth and just enough guilt to make refusal feel impossible. "You deserve one night for yourself," she had said, her voice smooth, hiding the gleam in her eyes. "There is a man, a good man, successful but kind, who asked about you." Claire had shaken her head at first, insisting that between work and Noah she had no room for dates, but Olivia pressed with the practiced persistence of someone who had always gotten her way. "Do it for me, do it for Mom. Do it because Noah deserves to see you happy." The words burrowed into Claire's conscience until finally she agreed, though unease gnawed at her. She dressed carefully that evening, choosing simple pearl earrings and the navy dress Olivia had laid out for her, unaware that the entire plan was designed not to uplift her but to see her fall. Olivia had set the pieces in place with the precision of a strategist. She had booked the table at the expensive restaurant, notified her circle of friends, and primed her phone to capture the moment. In Olivia's mind, there was nothing sweeter than public humiliation delivered under the guise of sisterly generosity. Lucas, meanwhile, had been invited under false pretenses as well. Olivia had whispered to him about a shy, intelligent woman who admired his company and had asked to meet him discreetly. He had not been impressed, but had agreed out of courtesy, thinking it would be a simple dinner a box to check before returning to his real responsibilities. He arrived expecting boredom, not revelation, and certainly not the tangled web of truth and lies waiting for him at that table. Claire had felt the trap closing the moment Lucas asked if she knew who he was. The mocking laughter from Olivia's table, the pointed glances, the recording light blinking red, all made it clear that this was a performance staged at her expense. Her first instinct had been to flee, to protect what little dignity she had left, but then she thought of Noah. She had promised him she would try. She remembered his eager smile when he asked if she would make a new friend tonight, his small hands helping her fasten her necklace as though it were armor. That memory held her in place. She kept her seat even as the walls seemed to close in. Olivia's friends whispered like a chorus of spectators, certain that Claire would crumble within minutes. What none of them expected was the sudden arrival of the children. Noah had been meant to spend the evening with Olivia's neighbor, but in a twist of chance, the woman had shown up at the restaurant with him in tow, saying she thought Claire might want him nearby after her dinner. At nearly the same time, Lucas had brought Sophie along because his usual nanny had canceled. He had arranged for her to sit quietly at a small table near the entrance with a hostess keeping watch. Fate, or perhaps some unseen hand, placed Noah and Sophie in the same room that night, and their paths crossed just as the tension reached its peak. Noah, energetic and curious, noticed the girl sitting alone and walked over. Sophie sat with her head bowed, her small hands folded in her lap. She did not speak, but when Noah introduced himself with an easy grin, she lifted her eyes briefly. Claire noticed the interaction, as did Lucas. Both parents stiffened, uncertain of what might unfold. Noah tried a few silly jokes, but Sophie remained silent, her lips pressing together in the familiar line of withdrawal. Something instinctive stirred in Claire. She pulled a napkin from the table, folded it with careful hands, and within moments had crafted a small origami boat. She set it gently in Sophie's glass of water, the napkin edges bobbing like sails. "It is a little ship," she said softly. Her voice warm, it can sail across storms and always find the shore. Sophie's eyes widened. For the first time in months, a faint smile curved her lips, hesitant but real. Lucas froze his chest, tightening. Dozens of therapists had tried countless exercises to coax a response, and none had reached her. Yet this woman, this stranger, had given his daughter a flicker of light with nothing more than a folded napkin. Olivia saw it too, and her triumph turned sour. She had orchestrated a spectacle meant to demean, yet instead the tables were shifting. Claire, whom she had painted as pathetic, had become the center of unexpected grace. The laughter at Olivia's table faltered confusion, replacing amusement. Claire herself barely noticed. She was focused on Sophie, offering a smile of encouragement, feeling Noah's small hand slip into hers as if to say, "See, Mom, you can do this." Lucas leaned forward, studying her, as though seeing something he could not categorize. The woman across from him was not the desperate opportunist he had expected, but someone whose presence had reached his daughter in a way that defied logic. The setup Olivia had engineered was unraveling before her very eyes. She shifted uncomfortably, forcing another laugh, but the sound rang hollow. For Lucas, the evening that had begun as a courtesy meeting was transforming into something he could not ignore. The cruel joke had set the stage, but the unexpected intersection of two children had changed the script entirely, and everyone in that room could sense it. The air in the restaurant seemed to shift. After that small paper boat touched the surface of the water, as though the mocking laughter from Olivia's table had been muffled by the quiet magic between two children. Sophie's shy smile lingered fragile yet luminous, and Noah's face lit up in response, his boyish enthusiasm untainted by the tension thickening around the adults. He leaned toward her and whispered something about how the little boat was strong enough to fight pirates. And though Sophie did not answer, she reached out with one finger to nudge the napkin sail across the glass. Claire's heart tightened at the sight, her own worries fading, as she watched her son draw another child into play. Lucas could not take his eyes off his daughter. Months of therapy sessions, countless professionals, and endless patience had yielded almost nothing, but here was a breakthrough sparked not by science or strategy, but by a single mother folding paper. He felt an unfamiliar sensation rising in his chest, a mixture of awe and longing, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had built his life on control, on precision, yet this moment was beyond him. Olivia, still seated with her friends, tapped her phone with increasing agitation. This was not the humiliating spectacle she had orchestrated. Her plan had been simple: lure Claire into an environment where she could not compete, let the powerful CEO dismiss her with a cold glance, and record the collapse. But instead of failure, Claire had become the quiet center of attention, her authenticity cutting through the artificial veneer of the night. Olivia's smile stiffened, but the fire of jealousy burned hotter behind her eyes. Noah, encouraged by Sophie's response, grabbed another napkin and began folding clumsily. "Mom, can you help me?" he whispered, sliding it toward Claire. She guided his small fingers, showing him how to crease the edges, her touch gentle. Sophie watched intently, her gaze following every movement, and when Noah triumphantly placed the second boat beside the first, she clapped her hands together, once a tiny sound, but a monumental step for her. Lucas exhaled sharply, a sound close to disbelief. For months, Sophie had barely reacted to joy or sorrow, her world muted by silence, but now there was light flickering in her eyes again. Claire glanced up, meeting his gaze across the table. His gray eyes, usually hard as steel, were unguarded in that instant, filled with something raw and vulnerable. She held his stare for a breath before looking away, her cheeks warm. The weight of Olivia's laughter still pressed at the edges of the moment, yet it no longer had the power it once did. Claire's nerves steadied her maternal instincts, overriding her embarrassment. She leaned towards Sophie and spoke softly, her voice low enough that only the children and Lucas could hear. "This boat is called the Brave One," she explained, "and it can carry wishes across the waves." Sophie tilted her head, absorbing the words, then slowly lifted the glass closer, as if helping the little ship sail. Noah grinned and added, "And this one is the strong one. Together, they can beat any storm." Claire's throat tightened. She had not expected this night to give her anything but pain. Yet here her son was creating bridges she never could have built alone. Lucas's hands tightened around his glass, his expression unreadable but intense. He had spent years searching for someone who could reach his daughter, and now he was watching a woman he barely knew do it with nothing but imagination. The irony cut deep and sweet all at once. Olivia's friends exchanged uneasy glances. The footage on the phone no longer looked like a humiliating prank. It looked like a tender family scene that would backfire if ever shared. Olivia hissed something under her breath, and one by one her friends grew quiet. Meanwhile, the waiter approached, uncertain of whether to interrupt, but Lucas's sharp glance silenced him. He ordered drinks with clipped efficiency, his voice steady, though his mind was far from calm. He turned back to Claire, his tone softer this time. "How did you know to do that?" he asked, gesturing at the boats. Claire shook her head. "I did not know. I just try little things with Noah. Sometimes it helps him when he is nervous." Her answer was honest, unpolished, and it struck him more than any rehearsed explanation could have. Sophie picked up her straw and began tracing invisible patterns on the table. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. Noah leaned closer and whispered conspiratorially, "Do you like glitter or blue better?" Sophie hesitated, then glanced at her mother and tapped twice on the table. Lucas froze. It was not speech, but it was communication a choice, and he had not seen that in so long. Claire translated gently, "I think she is saying blue." Sophie gave the tiniest nod. Noah beamed. "See, we can be friends." Claire swallowed against the sudden swell of emotion in her chest. She knew children could open doors for each other. Adults could never unlock. But watching it unfold in front of her was humbling. Lucas's gaze softened his eyes, lingering on her face, as though trying to memorize the exact expression she wore. For a moment, the entire restaurant faded Olivia's scorn, the waiter's curiosity, the expensive trappings. There was only the fragile connection forming at the table. Olivia shifted in her seat, rage simmering beneath her smile. She had not planned for Noah to appear, had not accounted for Sophie's reaction, and she certainly had not imagined Lucas would look at Claire with that kind of attention. She clenched her fists beneath the tablecloth, her nails biting into her palms, already recalibrating her strategy. For Claire, though, the night felt like a test she had passed without knowing the rules. She had walked in expecting judgment and had found instead a fragile thread of hope woven through the laughter of children and the simple act of folding paper. She glanced at her son, his face glowing with excitement, then at Sophie, who looked more alive than she had moments before, and across from her sat Lucas, still guarded but undeniably changed. In the span of a single evening, the cruel joke had unraveled into something none of them could have predicted. And though Claire did not yet understand the storm that was coming, she could feel the shift in the air, the promise that this was not the end of the story, but only the beginning. After that night, Claire told herself she would never see Lucas again, and yet his presence lingered like a shadow. She could not shake the memory of his eyes softening when Sophie smiled. Still burned in her thoughts, and the sound of Noah's laughter echoed whenever she tried to convince herself it had been nothing more than an accident. But Lucas was not a man to leave questions unanswered, and 2 days later he appeared at the health center under the pretense of discussing a potential corporate donation. Though his true purpose was clear the moment he mentioned Sophie's name and the way Claire had reached her with something so simple. Claire stiffened the walls she had built around her life rising higher, and she shook her head firmly, insisting she was no therapist, no healer, just a mother, doing her best with her own child, and that she had no business interfering in his family's pain. Lucas studied her with quiet intensity, his voice calm but edged with desperation, as he explained the months of failed therapy sessions and the countless nights spent watching his daughter retreat into silence. He admitted in rare vulnerability that he was running out of hope. Still, Claire refused her words clipped, as she told him she had already failed once before, when she could not save her ex-husband who had collapsed in the hospital and died before her eyes, despite her training and despite her pleas. She confessed she had promised herself never to take responsibility for another soul's healing again. Lucas wanted to argue, but he saw the steel in her eyes, and for the first time he hesitated. Later that evening, Noah tugged at her sleeve as she tucked him into bed, his wide eyes full of pleading as he whispered, "Mom, can we see Sophie again?" She smiled when you made the boat. She liked it. Claire's heart clenched, and she kissed his forehead, unable to answer, because the truth was she wanted to see Sophie too, and even more unsettling, she wanted to see Lucas, though she would never admit it out loud. Olivia, meanwhile, had not forgotten the humiliation of that dinner. Her carefully crafted spectacle had backfired, and now rumors whispered through her social circle that Claire had somehow impressed the cold billionaire. She seethed at the thought, telling anyone who would listen that her sister was nothing more than a single mom, grasping at a lifeline, spinning lies about how Claire was desperate for a wealthy man to rescue her. Some listened, some laughed, but Olivia knew that words planted like seeds had a way of growing into ugly truths if repeated enough times. Lucas kept his distance for a week, wrestling with his own conflict, torn between respecting Claire's refusal and his fear of watching Sophie's light fade again. Each night he replayed the moment in the restaurant when his daughter's small hands had pushed the paper boat, and each night the image eroded his resolve. Eventually he sent a message, polite but insistent, asking Claire and Noah to attend a charity picnic organized by his company at a city park. It would not be formal, just families' food and children playing, he said, and she could slip away at any time. At first she drafted a curt refusal, but Noah spotted the invitation on her phone and begged her with the boundless faith only a child carried And finally she relented. She told herself it was for Noah, for a day of fun, not for Lucas or Sophie, yet her pulse betrayed her when she saw him waiting for them by the entrance to the park, dressed casually in rolled-up sleeves and a watch that caught the sunlight. The push and pull between them was undeniable, now a current neither wanted to acknowledge, yet neither could escape. Claire kept her guard high, answering his polite questions with brevity. But when Sophie ran to Noah and the two children began to laugh together, her resolve softened again. Lucas noticed every flicker of her expression, every time her hand brushed Noah's hair back from his forehead. Every moment her laughter broke free, despite herself. He wanted to believe he could keep it professional, a matter of Sophie's well-being. But as the day unfolded, he felt the gravity between them pulling tighter. Claire sensed it too, and it terrified her. She told herself she could not be tangled in his world, that her life was simple and his was built on power and scrutiny. Yet her heart whispered another story every time his gaze lingered on her. The push and pull had begun, and both of them knew it was only a matter of time before one of them gave in. The invitation had been phrased so casually that Claire almost convinced herself it meant nothing. Just a polite gesture from a man who felt indebted yet. As Saturday approached, she found herself pacing her small apartment with a nervousness she could not explain. Noah bouncing with excitement about the idea of games and food at the big company picnic, while she wrestled with whether attending would only invite more whispers from Olivia or anyone else who had already begun spreading rumors. In the end, Noah's eager eyes won out, and so she dressed simply in a light summer dress, with flats braided his hair neatly, and told herself that this was just another community event, like countless others she had attended as part of her work. The park was transformed when they arrived, canopies strung with colorful banners, long tables laden with food laughter from employees and their families echoing across the lawn. Children ran with balloons, and a small stage had been set up for music later in the afternoon. Lucas was there near the entrance, not in his severe black suits, but in a white shirt, rolled at the sleeves, dark slacks, and a watch that caught the light. The sight of him dressed so simply made Claire's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way, but she quickly focused on Noah tugging at her hand. Lucas greeted them with a nod, his expression unreadable at first. But then Sophie peeked from behind him, her face tentative until she spotted Noah. At once she smiled small but real, and Noah grinned in return. Without hesitation, he grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a group of children chasing bubbles. Claire stood frozen, her heart swelling at the sight, while Lucas's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. For the next hour the children played together, Sophie laughing quietly at Noah's antics, her small hands holding onto his, as though he anchored her in a world that had been too silent for too long. Claire watched closely, amazed by how naturally Noah included her, how patient he was, and how Sophie's entire demeanor seemed lighter in his presence. Lucas watched too, though his eyes often strayed back to Claire, observing how she knelt to adjust Noah's shoe, or how she clapped gently when Sophie managed to join in a game. He saw in her the ease of a mother who loved without calculation, and it stirred something in him that he had buried since Emily's death. Later, when lunch was served, families gathered at picnic tables, and somehow Lucas and Claire found themselves side by side, helping arrange plates while the children sat giggling nearby. Their hands brushed once, when both reached for the same stack of cups. A fleeting contact that sent a jolt through Claire and made her retreat slightly, but Lucas did not pull back. Instead, he held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His voice quieter as he said, "You are different. You do not look at me like a CEO." She blinked, startled, unsure whether to laugh or deflect. But the intensity in his eyes rooted her in place. For a moment, the noise of the picnic dulled, and all she could hear was the rush of her own pulse. Claire looked away first, busying herself, with the plates telling herself not to read into it, not to let hope rise where it had no right. Yet the warmth in her cheeks betrayed her. Across the park, Olivia appeared dressed impeccably in a designer sundress. Her arrival unannounced but calculated. She spotted Lucas and Claire standing close, saw the children laughing together, and fury twisted inside her. This was not how the narrative was supposed to unfold. She had planned for Claire to be exposed as unworthy not to see her gaining ground in a place Olivia had coveted for herself. She forced a bright smile and glided toward them, greeting Lucas with exaggerated familiarity, ignoring the way his expression cooled at once. Claire stepped back, feeling the sting of her sister's presence like a knife between her ribs. Olivia complimented Sophie in a voice dripping with false sweetness, then turned her attention to Claire with a remark barely veiled as kindness. Something about how brave it was of her to come here without worrying what people might think. Lucas's jaw tightened at the insinuation, and Claire's stomach dropped, but before she could respond, Noah called for her to watch him race Sophie to the playground. Claire seized the excuse to walk away, her son's laughter pulling her from the trap Olivia had set. Lucas remained, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Olivia. He saw through her performance, recognizing the hunger beneath her words. And he felt a surge of protectiveness toward Claire he had not expected. Throughout the afternoon, Claire tried to stay on the edges, blending with the other families, but Lucas sought her out again and again, asking her opinion about small things, introducing her quietly to a few trusted colleagues, even sharing a laugh when Noah spilled lemonade and she scolded him gently. The ease unsettled her, but it also warmed parts of her she had thought long frozen. As the sun dipped lower and music began from the stage, children danced on the grass, their laughter rising with the notes. Sophie, hesitant at first, let Noah pull her into the group. Claire and Lucas stood side by side, watching, and in that moment, they looked almost like a family to parents, marveling at the joy of their children. Claire felt it too, and quickly reminded herself it was dangerous to imagine such things. But Lucas spoke softly, his words slipping past her defenses. "She has not smiled like that in years. Thank you." Claire shook her head, her voice unsteady. "It is Noah. He has a way with people." But Lucas's gaze did not waver from her. "No, it is you." The air thickened with unspoken tension, the kind that made her want to step closer and run away all at once. She glanced toward the children, her heart racing, and told herself this was nothing more than gratitude. Yet deep inside, she knew it was more. Olivia, watching from a distance, clenched her fists. She had seen the spark pass between them, seen the subtle shift in Lucas's posture when he spoke to Claire, and she vowed silently that she would not let her sister steal what she believed should have been hers. The picnic ended with sparklers handed to the children, tiny lights twinkling against the darkening sky. Claire held Noah's hand, while Lucas guided Sophie's, their fingers brushing once more as they steadied the children. For an instant it felt like fate, like four lives bound together under the quiet glow of fire and night. Claire tried to shake it off as coincidence, but the weight of Lucas's gaze on her lingered long after the last spark died. Olivia left the picnic with a smile, fixed so tightly it hurt her cheeks, but beneath it her fury seethed like molten glass. Every glance between Lucas and Claire had cut into her pride, and every laugh the children shared had mocked her ambition. She could not allow this to continue, and so she began to scheme with the cold efficiency of someone who had always believed she was entitled to more. She reached out to Victor Harlan, a senior vice president at Reed Biotechnics, known for his ambition and resentment of Lucas's authority, and over late-night drinks, she painted Claire as a manipulative single mother, trying to claw her way into Lucas's life-planting seeds of suspicion, until Victor leaned forward with narrowed eyes and asked what she wanted. Proof. Olivia answered smoothly, "We give Lucas something he cannot ignore, something that makes Claire look untrustworthy, and once he sees her true face, he will cut her out without hesitation." Victor, eager for leverage against his CEO, agreed to help, and together they devised a plan to plant sensitive company data on Claire so she would appear guilty of theft. Olivia smirked as she imagined her sister's face when security confronted her, when Lucas's gray eyes turned cold, when the fragile connection they had begun to build shattered. Days later, the opportunity came during a small networking event hosted at the company's headquarters, an evening Claire attended only because Lucas had quietly asked her to bring Noah so Sophie could see him again. Claire hesitated, at first wary of being in Lucas's world, surrounded by sharp suits and sharper tongues, but Noah's eagerness and Sophie's hopeful smile when she saw him made her agree. She dressed with quiet dignity, unaware that Olivia and Victor had already laid the trap. While Claire helped Noah settle with Sophie in a playroom set up for employees' children, Olivia slipped into her bag a small USB drive loaded with confidential files Victor had extracted. It took seconds, a sleight of hand, when Claire stepped away to answer a question from another guest, and by the time she returned, her purse looked untouched. Later that evening, as the event wound down, 2 security officers approached her with polite but firm expressions. "Miss Carter, we need to speak with you," one said, gesturing toward a private office. Confused, Claire followed her pulse quickening when they asked to see her belongings. Lucas arrived minutes later, his expression tense, and when the officers produced the USB from her bag, the room seemed to tilt. Claire's face drained of color. "I do not know what that is," she whispered, her voice shaking. Lucas's jaw tightened, the weight of evidence, clashing with the memory of his daughter's smile when Claire had folded a napkin boat. He wanted to believe her. Every instinct told him she was not capable of betrayal, yet the device gleamed in the officer's hand like a verdict. Olivia appeared in the doorway, feigning shock, her eyes wide with practiced innocence, as she murmured that she had warned everyone her sister was not who she seemed. The humiliation cut Claire to the bone. She looked at Lucas, searching his eyes for trust, but saw only conflict, and that hurt more than the accusation itself. Her voice steadied with quiet dignity as she said, "I will not stay where I am not trusted." She gathered her things, lifted her chin, and walked out before anyone could stop her. Lucas did not move his body taut with turmoil, but Sophie did. From across the room, she clutched the paper boat Claire had once given her, holding it to her chest as though afraid it might dissolve. Lucas saw it, and something inside him cracked, but he remained frozen, unable to speak. That night, Claire returned home, tears burning, as Noah asked why they had left early. She hugged him tightly, telling him some people wanted to believe bad things, but they would be all right. She hid her heartbreak behind a mother's strength, but alone in her room, she allowed herself to crumble, the image of Lucas's hesitation replaying like a cruel reminder. For Lucas, the night was no less brutal. He stood in his office, long after everyone had left, staring at the tiny boat. Sophie refused to let go of the symbol of trust Claire had given them both. He thought of her eyes as she walked away, not pleading but resolute, and the doubt gnawed at him. He had built his empire on logic and evidence, yet here he was torn apart by feelings he could not quantify. Olivia celebrated in silence, believing she had won, yet beneath her triumph lurked fear because she had seen the flicker of pain in Lucas's gaze, and she knew he was not a man easily manipulated. Still, she reassured herself that Claire's absence was permanent, that no CEO would risk reputation for a woman already branded with suspicion. What she did not realize was that sabotage often leaves traces, and that Lucas's heart, though wounded, was not so easily turned against the woman who had given his daughter back her smile. The fallout from the sabotage rippled quickly through Reed Biotechnics, and beyond whispers spreading across boardrooms and whispered conversations in the break room that the CEO had been romantically entangled with a single mother who had been caught with company data in her possession. A narrative Olivia fed with careful precision as she leaked selective details to colleagues and hinted to investors that Lucas was slipping, that his judgment had grown clouded, and by the end of the week, the board had demanded a full town hall to address both quarterly results and growing unrest about leadership. Lucas prepared with his usual disciplined slides, polished numbers exact, but inside he carried a weight heavier than any balance sheet. He had not spoken to Claire since that night, her silence a punishment sharper than any words, and Sophie's sadness deepened her small boat, clutched every night as she refused to sleep, until Noah's name had been whispered. Lucas told himself he had done the right thing by not defending Claire without proof, but the hollowness inside him suggested otherwise. On the day of the town hall, the auditorium filled with employees' board members seated in front rows, journalists invited quietly to observe, and the air carried the heavy expectation of a reckoning. Lucas stepped onto the stage in a dark suit, his voice steady, as he spoke of revenue growth innovations in therapy devices. Yet the tension did not ease because everyone waited for the unspoken topic, the rumor hanging like a storm cloud. When he opened the floor for questions, it came swiftly. Olivia rose from her seat. Halfway down the aisle, her posture regal, her voice pitched with false concern. "Mr. Reed," she began, "we appreciate your leadership, but many of us have noticed distractions lately." She paused, letting her words gather weight. "It has been said that certain relationships have compromised judgment, that trust has been misplaced. How can we as employees and shareholders believe in our future if leadership itself is clouded by questionable choices?" A murmur swept the crowd, sharp breaths exchanged glances. Lucas felt the sting but said nothing, his lips pressed thin. Olivia's eyes glittered with triumph, but then a movement drew every gaze. From the back of the auditorium, Claire walked slowly down the aisle, dressed in simple clothes that contrasted with the designer sheen of those around her. Her face was pale yet steady, her eyes fixed not on Olivia, but on Lucas. The room hushed as if oxygen had been pulled away. She reached the microphone, stood for a moment in silence, then spoke clearly. "I will not defend myself against lies." Her voice carried calm, but weighted. "What I will speak of is a child, a little girl who lost her mother and her voice." She looked toward the board, toward the employees leaning forward in their seats. Healing does not come from money or position. It does not come from being perfect. It comes from someone who understands loss, who is willing to sit in the dark until the light comes back. She glanced at Lucas, his eyes wide now, and then at the crowd again. Sophie does not need me to explain what happened. She can speak for herself. Gasps rippled as Sophie appeared from a side door holding Noah's hand. Both children escorted quietly by Lucas's assistant, who had slipped them inside. Sophie clutched her paper boat in one hand, Noah's in the other. She looked at the crowd, trembling, then at Claire. For a moment, silence threatened to crush her, but Noah whispered, "You can do it, Sophie, tell them." Sophie's lips parted, and for the first time in public, she spoke, her voice small but clear. "She helped me." The words were only 3, but they rang like bells, and the auditorium erupted in shocked cries. Board members turned to one another. Employees covered their mouths. Journalists scribbled furiously. Claire bent to Sophie's level, tears shining as she whispered, "You are so brave." Lucas felt his chest crack open, his daughter's voice breaking chains he had believed unbreakable. He stepped forward instinctively, but before he could speak, a commotion stirred near the side of the stage. A technician held up a tablet, face pale. "Sir," he whispered urgently, "you need to see this." On the screen was footage from a security camera showing Olivia and Victor near the coat check the night of the event. Olivia slipping something into Claire's bag, Victor glancing nervously around. The timestamp matched perfectly. Lucas turned the tablet toward the audience, his voice sharp with authority. "This is the truth. Claire Carter was framed." Olivia froze in her seat, her face draining of color as the image magnified on the large auditorium screen. Gasps turned to anger, murmurs swelling into condemnation. Olivia tried to protest, to spin words about misunderstandings, but her voice drowned under the roar of outrage. Lucas descended from the stage, his footsteps measured, and stood beside Claire, facing the crowd together. He placed a hand gently yet firmly on her shoulder, his voice steady. "I trusted evidence over instinct once, and it almost cost me the only hope my daughter has found." He looked at Claire, then his gray eyes filled with raw sincerity. "She is not a liability. She's the reason Sophie has spoken. If anyone questions my judgment, know this: I would rather stand accused beside her than be praised without her." The crowd erupted into applause, louder, longer, until the very walls seemed to vibrate. Olivia, shaking with fury and humiliation, was escorted out by security, her protests ignored. The board members, once skeptical, now bowed their heads in shame, acknowledging the truth they had nearly let slip away. Claire stood trembling, overwhelmed, until Lucas bent slightly and whispered for her ears alone, "Stay, please, do not walk away again." She blinked back tears, nodding faintly, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe this was not just survival, but the beginning of something more. Sophie tugged at her hand, then placing the little boat between Claire's palms. Her smile small but real, And in that moment, Claire knew the cruel joke that had begun it all had transformed into a truth far greater than Olivia could ever have controlled. The auditorium settled only after long minutes of thunderous applause, employees cheering not just for their CEO, but for the woman beside him, the mother who had reminded them all that healing begins with kindness. Lucas wrapped an arm gently around Sophie, his other hand brushing against Claire's as Noah leaned into her side. To the watching crowd, they looked like a family, born not from power or calculation, but from pain turned to hope. And though neither Claire nor Lucas said the words aloud in that instant, both knew the battle was no longer about sabotage or humiliation. It was about reclaiming their right to love and to heal, and it had only just begun. In the days following the town hall, the storm that had once threatened to swallow Claire shifted into calm employees who had once eyed her with suspicion, now greeted her with gratitude. Reporters who had prepared stories of scandal rewrote their drafts into narratives of redemption, and even the board that had nearly doubted Lucas admitted that the company's strength came not just from profit margins, but from its humanity. Claire, though vindicated, remained cautious, keeping her head down at the health center and focusing on Noah, yet everywhere she went, people whispered about the woman who had helped Sophie Reed speak again. Lucas kept his distance for several days, not because he doubted her, but because he feared overwhelming her. But one evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows of Claire's apartment, he appeared at her door, drenched from the storm and holding nothing but sincerity in his eyes. Claire hesitated before letting him in, her heart pounding as Noah slept in his room, and the small space suddenly felt too intimate for the weight of his presence. Lucas did not waste time with pleasantries. He stood in her modest living room, water dripping from his coat, and said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology." Claire folded her arms, wary the memory of betrayal still tender. "You did not trust me when it mattered," she said softly, and it hurt more than the accusation itself. Lucas's gaze dropped, his voice low with regret. "I have lived too long believing evidence over instinct, fearing that trust would only destroy me. But when you walked away that night, when Sophie held that boat as if it were her lifeline, I realized I had made the wrong choice." He took a step closer, his expression raw. "I do not just thank you for Sophie, I thank you for reminding me that hope is possible." Claire's throat tightened, her defenses trembling. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the warmth of his words, but fear still pressed against her ribs. Lucas reached out, not to touch her, but to let his hand hover near hers, an invitation rather than a demand. "I am scared," he admitted, his voice unsteady. "Scared to love again because I lost Emily. Scared to trust because I have been betrayed, but more than that, I am terrified of losing the chance to be with you." His words broke through her walls like sunlight piercing heavy clouds. Claire felt tears sting her eyes, her own confession rising. "I have spent years thinking I was not enough," she whispered, "that every failure meant I should never try again. But when I see Sophie laugh, when I see Noah care for her, I know I cannot keep hiding." Lucas finally touched her, then his hand warm as it closed gently over hers. The silence between them hummed with unspoken promises, and when he leaned forward, she met him halfway, their lips brushing in a kiss both hesitant and desperate, a mingling of fear and longing that left them trembling. It was not a perfect kiss, not the polished fantasy Olivia might have imagined, but it was real, the kind that tasted of rain and salt, and the fragile courage of two people daring to begin again. When they pulled apart, Claire rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and Lucas wrapped his arms around her as though he had finally found the anchor he had been searching for since the night Emily's car had spun out of control. Later, they sat together on the couch, speaking in hushed tones while the storm raged outside. They talked of Sophie's progress, of Noah's boundless energy, of the possibility of creating a foundation that would fund therapy programs for children struggling with trauma. Lucas's voice grew steadier as he outlined the plan, but his eyes never left her face, as if every detail depended on her agreement. Claire listened, her doubts slowly melting into a cautious hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by survival, but by love. And as she glanced at the closed bedroom door where Noah slept, she knew he too deserved this chance. Lucas reached for her hand again, their fingers intertwining, and whispered, "We can heal together." Claire nodded, her tears falling freely now because she finally believed it. 1 year later, the world around Claire and Lucas looked different. Not because the skyline had changed or because the seasons had turned, but because their lives had been stitched together into something whole and enduring, a tapestry woven from pain, transformed into hope. The cruel joke that had once humiliated her now, nothing more than the faint echo of a beginning that had led to love. The foundation they created together had grown beyond their expectations, raising funds through galas and community drives, providing therapy and safe spaces for children suffering from trauma. And every time Claire walked into one of the centers and saw a child laugh or speak, after months of silence, she felt tears well in her eyes, because she knew firsthand what it meant to see light return. Lucas stood beside her in these moments, not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man who had finally allowed himself to heal, his arm sometimes around her waist, his expression one of quiet pride that spoke louder than any speech he could give. Sophie flourished in ways that astonished everyone, her words slow at first, but growing more confident each day, until she could chatter with Noah in the back seat of the car, their laughter filling every corner of their blended family. Noah, too, thrived, no longer worried about whether his mother would always be alone, proud to introduce Sophie as his sister to friends at school, protective of her in a way that made Claire's heart swell. The wedding was simple by design, held outdoors in a meadow where wildflowers swayed in the breeze, sunlight spilling like gold over rows of chairs. Filled not with socialites, but with friends' children from the foundation and colleagues who had supported them, Claire walked down the aisle in a gown that was elegant but unadorned, Noah beaming as her best man, and Sophie scattering petals as the flower girl, her laughter carrying across the grass. Lucas waited beneath an arch of blossoms, his eyes never leaving Claire's, as though the rest of the world had dissolved. When he took her hands, his voice was steady, promising not just love, but partnership, not just devotion, but faith. And when he slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt every scar inside her soften. Olivia was nowhere to be seen, having vanished from public circles after her exposure, and no one mourned her absence. The vows ended with a kiss that was not hesitant this time, but certain, the sealing of a bond born in fire, yet tempered by trust. And as applause erupted around them, Claire felt Noah's small hand slip into hers and Sophie's into Lucas's, binding them together as a family. The reception was not lavish, but it was joyous tables filled with laughter children, chasing one another under strings of lights, music drifting across the night air. Claire and Lucas danced slowly, her head against his chest, his cheek resting lightly on her hair, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe in forever without fear. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the children dozed against cushions, Claire looked around at the circle of people surrounding them and thought back to that night in the restaurant, the cruel words, the mocking laughter, the weight of humiliation. She remembered Olivia's eyes, glittering with malice, and Lucas's first cold question, "Do you know who I am?" And she smiled because she knew now the answer. He was not just a CEO, not just a man carved from stone, but the person who had chosen to see her not as a joke, but as a partner, a mother, a healer, and a woman worthy of love. Lucas squeezed her hand, gently leaning close to whisper, so only she could hear. That night started as a joke, but it gave me everything. Claire pressed her forehead to his tears slipping freely and whispered back, "And it will never be a joke again." The stars shimmered above them, the meadow alive with the quiet hum of crickets and the soft laughter of their children. And in that moment, Claire knew she had not only survived the cruelty of the past, but had built a future strong enough to withstand any storm. The story that began with humiliation ended in a family, and as Lucas pulled her close beneath the canopy of night, she realized that sometimes the cruelest beginnings hide the most beautiful endings. Thank you so much for staying with me. Until the very end of this story, my dear friends and I want to take a moment to talk to you heart to heart, because stories like these are not just about characters on a page. They are about us, about the way life has a strange habit of turning pain into possibility, about how even a cruel joke or a moment of humiliation can become the doorway to love, to healing, and to a second chance that we never dared to dream of. I wonder, as you listened tonight, did you feel that spark inside your own heart? That question that lingers, do we believe in destiny? Do we believe that sometimes the people who come into our lives at the lowest points are the very ones who were meant to stay forever? I know many of you are watching from every corner of the world, from small towns and big cities, from quiet villages and bustling coasts. And I would love for you to share with me in the comments where you are watching from, because when I read those words, it reminds me that this community is bigger than one story. It is a family of hearts connected through love, hope, and the belief in something greater. And if you had to give this story a rating from 0 to 10, what number would you choose, not just for the romance, but for the way it made you feel, for the way Claire and Lucas fought through betrayal, found healing, and built a family that no storm could break? Your comments mean more than you know. They guide me, they inspire me, and they remind me why I keep creating these stories. Because each message from you is like a hand reaching back through the darkness to say, yes, I am here, yes, I believe too. If you have not yet subscribed, please consider pressing that button and ringing the little bell, so you will always know when the next story arrives, because there are so many more tales to share, filled with twists, filled with longing, filled with that quiet moment when two people look at each other and know that life will never be the same. Share this story with someone who needs hope tonight, with a friend or a loved one who might need reminding that love can still find us in the most unexpected places. And if you feel moved to support the channel further, you will find a link in the description where you can help us keep bringing these stories to life. Every little bit goes toward creating more moments like this, more journeys that touch the soul. But most of all, I want you to remember that you are part of this story too. Because without your listening, without your presence, these words would only be whispers in the dark. Together we make them shine. So tell me, where are you watching from? How did this story touch your heart? And what would you like to see next? I cannot wait to read every single comment. And until the next time we meet in another story, keep believing in love, keep holding on to hope, and never forget that sometimes the cruelest beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings.